Welcome to Dignified Family Transitions with Lilie the Lawyer.
Welcome to Dignified Family Transitions with Lilie the Lawyer. Lilie McRoberts is a Minnesota family law attorney and mediator who helps individuals and families navigate divorce and custody matters with a focus on problem solving, not conflict, and practical, respectful solutions. I'm Lisa Mosbey, and today we're talking about parenting plans and how families can create arrangements that work in real life, not just on paper. Welcome, Lilie. I'm looking forward to this conversation with you.
Thanks. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm really hoping that I can add a little bit of insight when people are trying to put together their parenting time schedules in Minnesota.
Perfect. What is the difference between parenting time and custody in Minnesota?
Well, so they're talking about two different things. So parenting time is something that traditionally we would have called visitation in Minnesota, and that's really the time that one parent or another parent is spending with the child after there's a breakup and after a court's getting involved. So that's going to be called parenting time. And we Minnesotans are trying to transition away from calling it visitation in Minnesota because it kind of rubs people the wrong way, and it kind of frames the narrative in a way that's, I think, unhealthy. If you're thinking about visiting your child, really it's time that you're spending with your child. So that's parenting time. And then custody is going to be dealing with, those are the legal labels that we assign in Minnesota. There's two custody labels in Minnesota. There's physical custody and then there's legal custody. Legal custody is going to deal with decision-making for the child and which parent, or if both parents have decision-making for the child. So it can either be joint or it can be sole legal custody. So the decision-making is going to be in three categories. It's going to be in education, and it's going to be in medical, and then it's going to also deal with spiritual decision-making. If a parent has joint decision-making, then that means that they are going to have to co-parent with the other parent when those necessary decisions come up as the child grows. If they have sole decision-making, they're still going to have to share information with the other parent, or at least the other parent is going to have access to the information, but they're going to be the one that can make those decisions on their own. And the thought is whether or not they are able to co-parent. And then physical custody is really dealing more with which parent the child is primarily residing with. But it's important to understand that you can have a child, you can have joint physical custody, even if the child is primarily living with another parent. And you can have sole physical custody when you have equal parenting time. So it's kind of confusing for people because they think, well, I have the child 75% of the time. That means that I have sole physical custody, and that doesn't necessarily track. So it's kind of confusing. Really, the label that has a whole lot more meaning is that legal custody. But those are the difference between custody and parenting time.
And that can be complicated for folks who've never had to negotiate their way through this. So what factors should parents consider when deciding between joint legal custody and joint physical custody?
Right. So there aren't, believe it or not, a whole lot of factors when you're trying to determine whether or not you should, let's say that you're coming to this situation and you're trying to work together to get a judgment from the court. Let's say that you are really hoping that you don't have to go to trial when you're working with your former partner and the other parent of your child. And the question is, when you're determining whether or not you want to ask the court for joint legal custody versus sole legal custody, is really the question is, can we co-parent? And so you're going to need to take a long, hard look at how you've communicated with that other parent in the past. It's also important when you're making this consideration. And really, if you're not in agreement with the other party, or you feel like you can't communicate with them, you still are going to want to be considering these things. It's also important to be aware of what the law says regarding legal custody and regarding physical custody in Minnesota. In Minnesota, there is a presumption that the parties should be awarded joint legal custody. However, that presumption flips, and so then it's presumed that one party should have sole legal custody when there's evidence of domestic violence in the relationship. So I like to tell my clients when they're trying to think about whether or not, when they're thinking about whether or not they should ask for sole legal custody, is to really think to themselves, not, is there evidence of domestic violence? I mean, obviously, if there is, then we need to have that conversation. But really more, how do I communicate with that other parent? Am I going to be able to articulate when I think that my child has certain needs, what those needs are, and why I think that, for example, we should let him be in the competitive soccer team that's super stressful, rather than not the competitive soccer team, or whether or not when he's in high school, if he's doing great in school, whether or not he should push himself to be in AP biology rather than regular biology, or if we think he may be on the spectrum and we may end up having issues with the IEP, are we going to be able to communicate those things? I mean, it really is like the too many cooks in the kitchen spoil the broth sort of thing. I mean, if the cooks work really well together, then great, let's have 10 sous chefs. But if they just can't communicate at all, then there's going to be a problem. And so those are really the factors that you want to be thinking about, is how do we communicate? And if you've done couples counseling, you've probably talked about the different ways that you communicate. But when you're trying to decide whether to ask for sole legal custody or joint legal custody, really, it should always be framed in, it's not about winning or losing. It's about what is going to be best for the child. Are we going to be able to come to the decisions that we need to make for the child together? And if you can, and you know that you can, don't push for sole legal custody, honestly, because it's not going to be good for the child. So that's kind of it's really not very many factors, but it's just that one thing.
And having both parents on their side is more important than winning, losing. That language doesn't really serve in this environment. That makes so much sense.
Well, and I think that if you see it that way, I honestly think that if you see it as winning or losing, the child is always going to lose. And then by definition, you're always going to lose.
And when parents are creating this parenting time schedule, what options do they have? What are the most important decisions that they need to be making?
So there are a lot of factors that go into creating a parenting time schedule. It's important to understand that the parenting time schedule doesn't need to be super elaborate. There's also an option in Minnesota to create what's called a parenting plan, which is different than a parenting time schedule. At minimum, in Minnesota, you are going to need to tell the court something about what the parenting time schedule is going to be, even if it's as simple as, we will decide our own who has parenting time when, and we'll communicate with each other, and it'll just be reasonable. And then how much parenting time. Parenting time schedules also need to say how much parenting time. So, and it's a number of overnights for a year. So like 92 overnights out of 365. At minimum, you need to say either the percentage of overnights or the number of overnights. And then you also have to talk about, at least say something about reasonable parenting time to both parties. Or it can be as elaborate as what Minnesota also has, is they have a packet that you can fill out and supplement with the court that gets into extraordinary amount of detail. I don't do parenting plans very often, but there's usually some sort of middle ground. And so what you really want to be thinking about is the needs of your child. Now, it's a really huge ask to have someone, let's say that you have a baby and the baby is 6 months old and you have a breakup, unfortunately, and then you have to tell the court what each parent's parenting time schedule is going to be until the child turns 18. And that's what we're doing. And Minnesota courts has, and I talk about this in every single podcast, I say, Minnesota courts website is amazing. But in this regard, it is offering a resource to parents that are going through these breakups and trying to pound this square peg into this round hole of how do I tell the courts what my child is going to need for the next 18 years when they go through these different developmental stages. The resource that Minnesota courts has put together, I will create a link. I am going to try to be making it so that every single time I do mediation, I offer this resource to the people that I'm mediating for ahead of time. But it's called the Child Focused Parenting Time Guide. And I'm going to make that resource available to you and you can review it because it talks about things like attachment or attachment theory, which is actually something that I never thought about until I got into this line of work. But a baby needs to have more frequent connections with the parent that they've attached to, which usually is both parents. And if they go too long without having those contacts, then they suffer and their development suffers over time. And so what I really get passionate about this because the more that I've learned about the effects the effect that you can have on a child's development by taking the time to really think about this, it could change our whole society if we actually took the time to do this. Like, we're always talking about where we're investing our resources. This is where I feel like, and of course I'm going to say use a hammer because I'm a carpenter. So, you know what I mean? Everybody takes it with their own, I think that you could have a huge impact on our society by actually taking the time to figure out how to design a robust parenting time schedule. So I'm going to refer you to that resource and just keep in mind that as the child gets older, they're going to need different things. So like in high school, they maybe only need week on, week off, or every other week. But when they're younger, it's going to be different. And so that's really hard to plan, but it's not impossible, and it can make a huge difference in the child's life. So
That's a great insight. I wouldn't have thought through that. Of course, they need different amounts of time. Lilie, what are some of the bigger challenges that parents run into when trying to create a parenting schedule together?
So we touched on that just a little bit. Obviously, the biggest challenge, without a doubt, is how do we accommodate the child's changing developmental needs in one order, and that's frankly the biggest challenge as far as something that's external. Like everyone struggles with that. I mean, if you're getting divorced and your child's 16, it's going to be a heck of a lot easier if you're getting divorced and your child's 3. But that would be the biggest challenge. But then the other challenge is really not understanding the kinds of problems that you're going to encounter on the front end and not really putting in the safeguards necessary into the order. I mean, it's a huge opportunity when you are in the very initial stages of going through a divorce or creating a parenting time schedule. And a lot of people have no idea that this opportunity exists, where you can, while you're still communicating in theory, even if it's just at the mediator, you can have a whole lot of control over the order. And when you for some reason, let's say you can't mediate, and then you can't come to an agreement, you lose all of that control. And then the judge is the one that tells you what the parenting time schedule is going to be. And the judge is going to do the best that they can, and they're going to try to learn as much as they can about the child. But the judge is never going to know the child the way that the parents know the child. And so I really think that being able to understand what is going to happen in the future that and plan for that now and come up with a plan for what we'll do in that case is another huge challenge.
And I can see where parents would get stuck in that. Based on your experience, looking back, what do parents often wish they had addressed in their custody and parenting time agreements from the beginning?
Yes. And so, it's always a tricky line because I love it when people are getting along, and I love it when they we don't need to have a parenting time schedule in place. And I agree. A lot of times that's true. A lot of times they can come up with what to do. And so then I don't push them to necessarily put together a huge parenting time schedule when they're my clients. And also when I'm mediating for two individuals, if they say truly, we can decide on our own. But what I always ask is, what are you going to do if you find yourself in a situation where you don't agree in the future? If you have joint legal custody, and you can't agree on whether or not your 16-year-old daughter should get that elective breast reduction surgery, or some other elective surgery, like a jaw surgery that's not technically required, but there's so many different things. And what are you going to do when one of you really doesn't want to increase the dose of the methylphenidate, and the other one really does think that it's necessary? Are you going to let there be a tiebreaker, or are you going to decide now and put it in your order? We don't want to have to go back to court. First of all, it's going to take you 6 months to even get on the calendar, and then another 3 months for the judge to issue an order. So maybe there's a tiebreaker that you can use, or maybe you can set up a parenting consultant. A parenting consultant is something where they kind of are going to make the decision for you. And then they'll modify it and update your order accordingly. So that's one of the things that people don't think about, is what are you going to do if it doesn't go the way that you're planning? And it doesn't take that long to add that provision into your order.
Lilie, what would you like to leave the audience with today? Your final thoughts?
My final thoughts are, with any contract, it feels like the more that you're putting in there, the more that you're not trusting, or you might be pushing too hard. It's actually opposite. Contracts are there to help preserve the relationship of the parties. And so they're not there to alienate the relationship of the parties. They're there to make it so that your boundaries are clearly defined. If this happens, then we do this, is so lovely because it can kind of take emotion out of the equation. So please don't hesitate to take the time to think about these things going into the contract. And a divorced, a joint petition or a stipulated divorce decree is a contract. It's also a judge's order. So take the time now, because it actually can make your relationship better in the future.
Well said. I want to thank you for your insights today. This is a complicated issue, and I bet in the history of marriage, people don't always agree on this, or very, very often there's disagreement. So having somebody who's on their side, who can mediate through these things and guide us along the way, is so very important. So again, thank you for sharing your guidance.
Oh, thank you so much. I was so happy to be here.
That's it for today's episode of Dignified Family Transitions with Lilie the Lawyer. If you're working through a divorce or custody matter and want to create a parenting plan that works for your family now and in the future, you can learn more about Lilie McRoberts and her work at minnesotasfamilyattorney.com. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to like, subscribe, and come on back next time. We'll see you there.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.